Hello, and welcome to today's program on gluten-free eating. My name is Shannon Carter. I'm a family and consumer sciences educator with Ohio State University Extension, and today I'll be sharing with you just some overview about gluten-free eating. What are some of the underlying reasons people might want to eat gluten-free, and then how does one go about doing that safely? To start off, let's get on the same page with defining gluten. It's a sticky protein as found in wheat, rye, and barley. Gluten's role in foods is that it helps hold them together and provide structure. In fact, it comes from the Latin word meaning glue. Some people are concerned about gluten due to these three medical reasons of wheat allergy, celiac, and non-celiac gluten sensitivity. Wheat allergy is a person's reaction of their immune system to the protein in wheat, and that overreaction may cause a range of symptoms from mild to severe or even fatal. Currently, the wheat allergy affects about 0.4% of the US population. Celiac is a serious autoimmune disease that's triggered by the consumption of gluten. In fact, celiac is the only autoimmune disease with a known trigger, which is gluten. Now, when a person with celiac disease consumes gluten, it sets off a reaction where the body starts to attack the small intestine and it blunts the finger-like projections called villi. Now, this villi's job is to absorb nutrients. So if those are damaged, then the body is not absorbing the nutrition that it needs. There are over 200 symptoms associated with celiac disease that affects many of the body's major symptoms. It's estimated to affect about 1 in 100 people worldwide. They're estimating also that about 2.5 million Americans are undiagnosed and therefore at risk for long-term complications. Celiac is usually diagnosed by a gastroenterologist through a blood test and then a follow-up endoscopy. If it's left untreated, it can cause serious complications, including malnutrition, intestinal damage, and other complications. Individuals with celiac disease must avoid gluten and follow a strict gluten-free diet for life. People do not outgrow celiac. The good news is that once gluten is removed from the diet, the damage that's caused by celiac will reverse and the villi will heal and regrow. Someone who suffers symptoms similar to the celiac symptoms, but perhaps they don't test positive to celiac disease, may have what we call non-celiac gluten sensitivity. It's estimated that about 18 million Americans have gluten sensitivity, and that's about 6 times the amount of Americans who have celiac disease. More research is needed to understand this non-celiac gluten sensitivity. They think it may have to do with affecting a different part of the small intestine, which is why it may not test positively when they're tested for celiac. Now, you may have noticed the ever increasing amount of gluten-free foods available to us. In fact, currently, it's one of the most popular diet trends in the United States. 1 in 5 people are looking to reduce or eliminate gluten from their diet. So this consumer demand is driving up the availability of gluten-free foods for us. It's also driving down the cost just a little bit, but we still in 2015 spent $4 million on gluten-free foods. So for those who assume that eating a gluten-free diet may help them to lose weight or it may help them to be healthy, that is really left up for debate. And one of those reasons is that it depends on how you go gluten-free. If you eat naturally gluten-free foods and whole foods, that would be a healthier option than many of the gluten-free substitutes that are available. They often tend to add more fat and sugar, as well as be lower in fiber. So if you are considering going gluten-free, it's important that you start by talking with a doctor because part of that diagnostic process relies on the current and active consumption of gluten to be accurately tested first. Gluten-free diet then is something that you would want to also consult with a dietitian. especially those that are knowledgeable with celiac disease or the gluten-free diet, just to make sure that you are still ingesting a variety of balance in nutrients and fiber. You would also want to think about other family members as well. If you're the only one going gluten-free in your household, will you be preparing separate gluten-containing foods for others? Do you have adequate space and storage for preparing gluten-free food separate from gluten-containing food? So all some things there to consider. There is a fact sheet available about other important considerations that you might want to read if this is something that you are thinking about. And I will put at the end of this program the website where you can find that fact sheet. And as you know, if you've looked at gluten-free foods, you may note that they can cost more than their gluten-containing counterparts. But if you have that medical diagnosis or you have made that decision to go gluten-free, let's talk about how you can do that safely. So first of all, where to find gluten-free foods in the store. Some stores have a specific gluten-free section. As you can see in the photo here, that's labeled clearly that that whole aisle is gluten-free. You will also find gluten-free items throughout the entire store mixed in and next to gluten-containing items on the shelves. That's why it's important to always read the list of ingredients so that you know what is in that food. And looking for the words gluten-free on the package can be very helpful. You may find that there are some smartphone apps that allow you to scan a UPC label and indicate whether that item contains gluten. But keep in mind that someone had to type in all of that information. So these apps are only as accurate as the app developer. So the best case there is to really read your own for yourself, read that list of ingredients. Unfortunately, there is no standard gluten-free label. These are just some of the logos or labels that you may see on different packages. Currently, the FDA regulation doesn't require manufacturers to place a food's gluten-free claim in any specific location on the label. So you may be having to look that food item over several times until you find that. Also, you may see it as that one noted in the center that says certified gluten-free. Some manufacturers may choose to include the logo of a gluten-free certification program. So that means they have taken an extra step to hire an outside third party to test their food for gluten-free. However, the FDA does not endorse, accredit, or recommend any particular third-party gluten-free certification program. Unfortunately, there are also some very confusing labels out there. And for those with celiac and those who have to be very cautious about avoiding all potential hidden sources of gluten, it's really important that we have clear labels. And these would be examples of some confusing or ambiguous labels that tend to get around the labeling law. They might use terms such as no gluten ingredients and made without gluten. Those might be some of the things that you see on products. So you might want to ask yourself, why aren't they just using the standard language of gluten-free? For example, the one in the middle says gluten-free, but it also says contains ingredients safe for a gluten-free diet. And the fine print near the ingredients on this particular package, it was a package of sliced almonds, and it said that they were processed on lines that also processed wheat. So in that case, they could have had an additional allergen statement, which is like a may contain statement. So let's talk about allergens next. These are considered the 8 main allergies in the United States as supported by a law and regulated by the FDA. So these 8 major allergens, the one that we're concerned with here with gluten, of course, is wheat, but also want to note that those with celiac and gluten sensitivity also have to avoid rye and barley and their derivatives, such as malt is made from barley. So in addition to wheat, which is a major allergen, we also have to be concerned about rye and barley, which currently are not required to be disclosed according to this allergen labeling law. You'll find allergens listed in bold in the ingredients, and they may also have a separate contains statement or a may contain statement to show that, Perhaps they were mixed in something on lines where one of the allergens was processed. So typically, when we think of gluten in foods, we think of the breads group and all of the foods associated with breads group. Now, these are not the only sources of gluten. In fact, if you look at this list, this may look like things that you wouldn't think typically would include gluten, but in fact, all of them must be verified by checking the label or the manufacturer. So any of these foods that are on your grocery list, make sure again that you are reading that ingredient list. And if you're still unsure, always call the manufacturer. I recommend keeping a notebook of when you have contacted manufacturers and what their response was so that you can keep that log moving forward and keep track of all that you are learning in this process. Now, of course, the most cost-effective and healthy way to follow a gluten-free diet is to eat these naturally gluten-free food groups. Foods in the least processed state are more likely to be gluten-free. Once meat is processed, even if they're just adding seasoning, it must be scrutinized for gluten by reading those labels or by contacting the manufacturer. There are a number of gluten-free grains and starches available to us. These are just some of them. Now, it's important to note that those with celiac or gluten sensitivity should only consume oats that are labeled gluten-free. And that's because cross contact might occur when those oats are either grown or harvested. So we want to make sure if you're eating oats that they are labeled certified gluten-free. So when cooking with gluten-free items, a lot of times you might find that there's not much change you need to do and compared to gluten-free and gluten-containing as far as how those foods cook. Pasta, for example, you might find that the only difference with cooking gluten-free pasta is that you might need to stir it a little more frequently to keep it from sticking. The If you put a little bit of oil in your water while you're boiling your noodles, it doesn't really help the gluten-free pasta like it does the wheat pasta. So again, on pasta, it would just be stirring it a little bit more. So just kind of learning to work with some of those gluten-free substitutes as you are getting more familiar with the gluten-free diet, you can become a little bit more comfortable in how those work. If you are preparing both gluten-containing and gluten-free foods in your home, that can be an extra challenge because you really have to pay attention to which foods you're cooking for which person and maybe even which spaces you're cooking them in because you want to avoid any contact with gluten, and that's something we call cross contact. So this is what happens when gluten-free food or ingredients come into contact with gluten. Generally, it's through shared utensils or a shared cooking or storage environment. So those listed would be some common sources of cross contact. So in order to be safe for someone with celiac disease or extreme gluten sensitivity, their food must not come into contact with any food containing gluten. And if you've ever tried to scrub a colander that's had pasta in it, you know how sticky and um, starchy that pasta can be and how hard it is to get it out of each little hole in that colander. And that's why we recommend really just getting a new colander if you're switching to gluten-free. Um, Same with a cutting board. Anytime there's grooves or a porous surface, anything that can't be scrubbed, it's a good idea to get a separate one and label it separate, maybe get different colors so you can keep them apart. Condiments, thinking about butter or margarine dishes, if you're buttering a piece of toast and you dip that knife back into the butter, are you taking crumbs with it? When it comes to airborne wheat flour, if you have both gluten containing and gluten-free flours in your home, when you use a mixer or stir up flour, it tends to float through the air. So think about that and trying to keep that under control if you have that wheat flour in your home and also are trying to cook with someone for someone who is celiac or gluten-free. Baking gluten-free, certainly if you're gluten-free, you do not have to give up baking. It can be a little trickier because the flours just operate a little bit differently. Some of the things that you might have to play with or experiment a little bit with when you're learning to bake gluten-free would be the baking times. Sometimes gluten-free products take a little bit longer to cook. Sometimes they take a little bit less, depending. The flavors can be a little bit different because all the things that go into a gluten-free flour, in effect, if you read some of the mixes and see what type of starch is in there, you might find that there's starch made from green peas in in that mix. So sometimes it can be a little bit different taste. So you can try adding, extra vanilla or spices, something to kind of offset some of those flavor differences. Freshness, you'll notice, also can be a little bit different. Gluten-free food items don't tend to have quite as long a shelf life as the gluten-containing counterparts. They also tend to dry out a little bit longer, the baked goods. Leavening might be a little bit different. A lot of times gluten-free foods will use more eggs to help with the structure as well as the leavening in those products. Moisture. Gluten-free flours tend to be very dry, and so you might have to add a little bit more moisture to the recipe. There's a lot of different ways to do that. You can add in some pureed fruit or applesauce. Sour cream and yogurt work really well to moisten baked goods. You can also do something as simple as using brown sugar instead of white sugar to add a little bit of moisture. Consider using a little bit of honey as well. Then nutrition, if there are ways to bake whole grains with baking gluten-free, you just have to, again, experiment and get a little bit creative. Here's some examples of some of the different gluten-free flours available. Some from a grain source, some from nuts, and then there's some that are both grain and nut-free. Now you'll find that each of these have a little bit different characteristics. They might vary in protein content, in taste, in density or weight. So the heavier grain flours usually have more protein and they're hearty and nutritious. Those might include flours like millet, quinoa, buckwheat, some nut flours, beans and legumes, as well as cornmeal. And baking with those might be more similar to baking with straight whole wheat flour in that it results in a dense, dark baked good that doesn't rise very much. So that's why those flours are usually not used alone. The most commonly used lighter gluten-free flours is the white rice flour, which leads to lighter colored, less dense texture in the baked goods. And then you have the medium weight flours giving similar results to gluten-filled all-purpose flour, such as brown rice flour, oat flour, and sorghum. So there are a lot of great recipes out there, and just encourage you to experiment and have some fun trying some different ones. You might find that the commercial gluten-free flour blends a great place to start. You can use them oftentimes in a cup for cup measure in a recipe that calls for regular wheat-based all-purpose flour. If you have a commercial gluten-free flour blend, you can often just substitute that, and that's a great way to learn and start learning to bake gluten-free. You may have to experiment with different brands here as well. You also might want to try making your own gluten-free flour. Just keep in mind that one flour type alone cannot replace all the properties of the all-purpose white or even whole wheat flour. So it's recommended to make a blend of the different weighted gluten-free flours and starches to replicate the flavor, texture, and density of the gluten-filled flours. So one rule of thumb is to use a 2-to-1 ratio of flour to starch. So a gluten-free flour blend could be as simple as 1 cup of rice flour for every half cup of tapioca starch. But you have to be careful because too much starch can make the products kind of gummy. So again, just trying to experiment with some of the flours and find out what some of your favorite ones are. When it comes to eating out, gluten-free folks don't have to give that up either. It just takes a little bit more planning ahead and a little bit more preparation. So you can start by looking for restaurants that offer gluten-free options, and you can do that search on the web ahead of time, or there are some great smartphone apps that are helpful in this process. The one I like is called Find Me Gluten Free, and you can search in a certain location if you know where your party will be eating out. And then finding out what does that restaurant have to offer in terms of gluten-free food items. Do they have a separate menu you can look at? Do they have a nutrition and allergen list that will list exactly what's in each food? And then if you can ask ahead of time, maybe call ahead at a time when that restaurant is not busy and ask about their cross contact. How do they keep their gluten-free foods separate? How do they prepare them? How do they serve them so that they don't get confused? And then be sure when you do this to use the words cross contact, as that applies to allergens. If you use the word cross contamination, that applies to foodborne illness. So we want to make sure that we talk about contact when we're referring to allergens. So again, I encourage you to again just kind of do a little bit of planning ahead and looking ahead as far as eating out. And this is a case where there's so many more options available to gluten-free diets now than there were even just 5 or 10 years ago. Well, I hope that you have picked up a couple tidbits and some helpful information today. If you would like more information, here's a website that can be helpful in um, just a list of resources and additional websites and fact sheets and other webinars as well. And that website is go.osu.edu/gluten-free eating, all one word. And here's some of my favorite sources listed here. Two that I'll note in particular: beyondceliac.org and celiac.org. That is the Celiac Disease Foundation website. Both of those offer complete programs and guides and fact sheets and resources and recipes available to anyone going gluten-free. It's all research-based and very credible information. Again, my name is Shannon Carter, and if you would like to reach me, the easiest way to do that is via email. You can do that at carter.413@osu.edu, or our office phone here is 740-653-5419. Thank you for joining me today, and I hope you'll check out that website for additional information.